So for today's video, I prepared 5 examples of star answers to behavioral questions that each contain some problem. So I'll first go through the answers to the example, and then I'll talk about what's wrong with it. So try to spot this in advance if at all possible. The first scenario I want to talk about here is an answer to a failure story, to a failure question. Tell me about the time when you failed, and the sample answer would be, I believe it's impossible not to have failed at least once, and I'm certainly no exception. So when I do fail at my task, I ensure that I take ownership of my failure and learn as much as possible about it. For example, if I fail to meet a deadline, I'll always ensure that I meet my manager to discuss what I could have done better to prevent it. So you see, this example, although it might sound to someone just getting started with behavioral answers that it might sound that it follows the STAR format, it's actually not a specific example. It's a hypothetical one. Whenever I'd have to deal with such a situation, I do this. And even if I used, at a certain point, for example, if I fail to meet a deadline, that's still a hypothetical example. So this defends the purpose of this defeats the purpose of behavioral interviewing, that is to look at your past behavior to predict your future performance on the job. So it's always mandatory to use specific situations when giving your STAR answers. Now let's look at another example to the question, tell me about the time when you had to quickly adjust your priorities to meet changing demands. And the example answer would be, I remember when we had a project to move an important customer to the cloud. We had a timeline of 6 months. Due to the size of the project, I took every possible measure that I was aware of to leave time for unexpected events. And one such event actually happened when we underestimated the transition of 3 large databases containing sensitive information. This happened towards the end of the implementation, so I really had to bring in my A game. I had to call in the best DB migration expert from our business to streamline the process, and he had to learn the entire project in a few days, but I convinced leadership this is a risk worth taking if we wanted to have a shot at meeting the deadline. And I was right. We finished the project even a few days early, and our customer, who was kept informed about the progress at every moment, was really happy and in fact kept sending us work to this day. Now you see, this is not a terrible example, terrible answer, but you might have spotted from the way I communicated that I was rambling every now and then. And this is primarily for 2 reasons. The most important reason here is that you can see this is not a polished answer. It's actually the answer that I gave from the first time I wrote the scenario for this video. So you could definitely polish up and be more concise. But another problem and the real issue that I wanted to touch upon here is that it fails to mention the metrics that matter into this project. I mean, okay, yes, there were 3 large databases, but how big was the project overall? How large were those databases, and why was it so a mandatory thing to call in another DB expert? Why was the existing one, wasn't he capable of doing this? And if he wasn't capable, it means you have done something wrong at estimating the resources, when in fact, it could have been simply a security clearance issue. I'm just saying here. So you can see there is a lot of work that you can do to polish up your answers, and by including the metrics that are the most relevant to that specific example, it will always make it a lot clearer as to what's actually going on there, even if your communication skills are not, you're not an expert communicator with these things. So if you'll just try to reframe and repolish your answers, you'll see that they will significantly improve, especially while practicing them. That's how you assess in the best possible way. But long story short, again, make it more concise and make it contain metrics, because metrics will help you to communicate easier. Now, the third example. Refers about another problem with failure stories. And again, the answer would be something like, to the question, tell me about the time when you failed, would be something like, I believe it's impossible not to have failed at least once, and I'm certainly no exception. So when I do fail at my task, I ensure that I take ownership of my failure and learn as much as possible about it. Let me tell you about a specific such instance when, and there I would go with the specific failure story, unlike in my first example, if you remember. Now, the problem with this is that some people prefer to use this introductory general statement even before talking about the failure story, or even before presenting the example. And this is, it's not the biggest problem in a job interview, but you're actually losing time. You're losing precious time to get right into the point, the actual example itself. So if you can, try to avoid that broad statement before your actual star answer, because many of you, I know, have this tendency to generalize at first and only then get into specifics. You won't score any more points. So I believe you're a lot better off if you get right into it and present your star answer as per the situation, task, action, and results. Situation and task could also go hand in hand. Now let's go to the fourth example, and let's take a look at another example of a failure story. So an answer to tell me about the time when you failed, or tell me about a recent failure that you had. And the sample answer would be, 6 months ago I was tasked with the completion of a complex report on transfer pricing with a timeline of 2 weeks. It was right at the end of the year, which is a very busy period for any finance department. At first, I thought the risk was worth taking since it didn't look too complex. However, due to my workload, I had to put it aside until the beginning of the second week, and because of this, I didn't have the time to properly revise my report and actually realized on the day of the deadline that it contained some mistakes which I needed to address. I immediately notified my manager about this and all the other impacted teams, which took a bit of delay because of this. It took me 3 more days to complete it, and I definitely learned a lot about transfer pricing and eventually became a subject matter expert. Right, so this is an answer to tell me about the recent failure. So the failure was that that report on transfer pricing wasn't done on deadline, and this impacted the deadlines of subsequent teams. Now, the problem with this answer is towards the end, in the learnings part. It took me 3 more days to complete, and I definitely learned a lot about transfer pricing and eventually became a subject matter expert. Right, so this is the learning. This is not, so the learning from this mistake was that the candidate should have been better on transfer pricing, which is actually not the true learning of a failure story. I mean, when you have such a failure, the true learning of the story should have been that they were better off had they inquired on how to get this project done much quicker, much sooner in the first week, not to leave it towards the second week and then risk, unsuccessfully take a risk to delay that project. So when you're talking about the learnings in a failure story, you're talking about your learnings from that project, which of course, could also be technical ones, but the main learning here, I mean, had she, okay, so what if you learned about transfer pricing, you still delayed your team? Next time you'll have to do a report on some another complex accounting term, you're going to fail again because you don't know that term, so you're going to fail and you're going to learn, and you basically learn nothing from the situation, right? So my point here is the learnings should convince your interviewer that you won't fail again to meet the deadline, right? So these were the true learnings of this failure story. So also with respect to failure stories, I would even go as far as to recommend you to have half of your answer on the learnings, simply because the interviewer, when asking you about the failure story, will be interested in 2 things. The first one, if it's a proper failure, and in this example it is, because I said that it impacted subsequent teams and impacted their workload as well. And second, about the learnings. So that's why I would encourage you to talk about, for even half of the time, about those learnings, simply because it's really important. It's the main thing in a failure story. So don't confuse the learnings don't be superficial on the learnings. This is very, very important. Now, the last example would be a sample answer to tell me about a successful project. And the sample answer would be, in a recent university project, working as a software engineer, I was part of a team of 6 people working on a very interesting machine learning project assigned to us by Microsoft, and because they were looking to hire talent from our school. The goal of the project was to accurately count the number of cats in a given picture as quickly as possible. They were very supportive of us and came on site for a day to explain us the intricacies of this project and to help us to brainstorm for the best possible ideas. Me and my team were very excited about the task, which we found quite challenging, but we managed to implement the algorithm pretty quickly in just 1 week and then accurately determine the number of cats. In the end, our algorithm won the top spot with a 96% accuracy and 8 seconds for 100 photos as average speed. Now, again, this is a good answer overall, but you could have definitely done it even better had the situation, that introductory paragraph, been a lot more concise, even in half. So the idea that I'm trying to transmit here is that the STAR method, the situation and task, often go hand in hand. That's why some people, coaches even recommend using the SAR method. In other words, reducing the T, the task, simply because of the danger of talking too much about the situation and task in a story, when in fact it's usually the action and the result that actually matter in communicating the idea that you want to transmit here. So had I used only a sentence for the situation and task, we had a school project sponsored by Microsoft to do some machine learning algorithm, it would have been enough for this instead of using an entire paragraph. So it's it's a rather subtle improvement, but if you think about it, you bring clarity to the discussion if you are more concise and if you get to the point as quickly as possible. So these were the 4 examples that I wanted to talk about in this video. Hopefully you found this interesting, and thank you very much for watching.